It's not just about numbers and policies. It's about real people whose lives are turned upside down by these decisions.
And it wasn't just hurt feelings either, right? CNN was pointing out that retaliatory measures were already in place and things were only going to escalate from there. They even talked about Canadian stores like pulling U.S. products off their shelves.
Yeah, it's wild to see how quickly a trade war can go from like this abstract concept to real world actions with immediate consequences.
Yet,
Supply chains get disrupted, consumer choices change, and there's this like cloud of uncertainty hanging over businesses. They hate that.
and speaking of impact, this wasn't just about numbers, right? It had real consequences for families, communities, especially those whose livelihoods depended on cross-border trade. Like imagine you're a lumber worker in British Columbia and suddenly you're facing the prospect of losing your job because the US market just became way too expensive.
The human cost of these kinds of disputes, it often gets lost in the shuffle, but it's a crucial part of the story. It forces us to think about the individuals, the families caught in the crossfire of these geopolitical chess matches.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, but at the end of the day, it's people's lives that are being affected.
Yeah.
Because so we've got this sense of shock, betrayal, and real economic pain being felt in Canada. But let's zoom out for a second. This wasn't just about Canada. This was about the U.S. sending a message to the world.
Right, and that message was being received loud and clear by other countries. It was like a shift away from the traditional collaborative approach to global trade and diplomacy. Remember, we talked about multilateralism earlier. Well, this trade war seemed to signal that the U.S. was moving towards a more unilateral, America-first approach.
So basically, the U.S. was saying, we're going to do what we think is best for us, even if it means stepping on some toes along the way.
And that created this ripple effect of uncertainty across the globe.
Yeah.
Other allies were looking at the U.S. like, wait, are we next? Can we still count on the U.S. as a reliable partner?
It's like that trust, that foundation of any strong alliance, it starts to erode.
Exactly. And without trust, it's so much harder to cooperate on issues that require global collaboration, things like climate change, nuclear proliferation, fighting terrorism.
So this trade war, even though it was specifically between the U.S. and Canada, had the potential to unravel this whole system of global cooperation that had taken decades to build.
It's a great point. It really highlights the interconnectedness of everything, right?
Mm.
We can't just look at this as an isolated event. We have to see it within the context of these broader shifts in global power dynamics.
Okay, now while all of this is unfolding, it's important to remember that the media played a key role in shaping public perception of the trade war.
Oh, absolutely. The media acts as this lens through which people try to make sense of complex events. And different media outlets with their own perspectives and biases, they're going to offer different interpretations of what's happened.
Right. So you had some outlets that were more sympathetic to the U.S. position, emphasizing the need for fair trade practices and holding allies accountable. And then you had others that were more critical, focusing on the negative impacts on Canada and the potential for wider global instability.
And it's up to us as informed citizens to be aware of these different perspectives, to critically evaluate the information we're consuming. Like, who's telling the story?
Hmm.
What are their motivations? What information might be missing?
It's like being a detective, right? Piecing together the different parts of the puzzle to get a clearer picture of the truth.
Exactly. And that critical thinking is even more crucial today in a world where information is constantly bombarding us from every direction.
Okay, so we've talked about the impact on Canada, the wider implications for global cooperation, and the role of the media in shaping perceptions. But now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the long-term consequences. What were the lasting effects of this trade war on Canada's economy and its place in the world?
Well, one of the most significant outcomes was that it forced Canada to really reevaluate its economic dependence on the U.S. They'd always been so closely tied. But this trade war was a wake-up call.
Like realizing you've been putting all your eggs in one basket, and suddenly that basket is looking pretty wobbly.
Exactly. So Canada started to diversify its trade partnerships, looking for new markets and opportunities beyond the U.S. They also began to invest more in their own domestic industries and explore ways to become more self-reliant.
So in a way, this crisis could be seen as this catalyst for Canada to forge a more independent path on the global stage. Not necessarily in opposition to the U.S., but not just blindly following in its footsteps either.
Precisely. It's about finding their own voice, their own place in the world.
Now, before we jump into the final part of our deep dive, I want to bring another voice into the mix. Remember General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander we mentioned earlier? Well, he had some pretty strong opinions about this whole trade war.
Yeah, his perspective is so valuable because it comes from someone with deep experience in international affairs and security matters. He's not just looking at the economics. He's thinking about the broader geopolitical implications.
And he was right there with Trudeau, believing that the fentanyl issue was being used as a pretext, that the real reasons for the tariffs were way more complex.
What's really interesting is that General Clark saw this trade war as part of a larger pattern of the U.S. retreating from its traditional role as a global leader and a champion of multilateralism.
And he was particularly worried about the U.S. cozying up to adversaries like Putin while simultaneously alienating its allies. He saw that as a dangerous strategy, one that could embolden Russia and ultimately undermine U.S. security interests in the long run.
His analysis really highlights the potential for unintended consequences. When you start picking fights with your friends and trying to appease your enemies,
Yep.
it disrupts the balance of power and creates opportunities for those who might want to exploit those divisions.
So we've got this trade war that's shaking the foundations of the U.S.-Canada relationship, potentially unraveling global cooperation and creating opportunities for adversaries to step into the void. It's a lot to unpack, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. What lessons can we learn from all of this? How can we apply these insights to understand the world we live in today, 5 years later? So we've explored the